morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue our journey, A Prophet in Babylon, with Chapter 15, Part A. The month was near its close. The first Sunday in March was now imminent. With the approach of this day which meant so much, a sense of great solemnity and awe fell on Gaunt's mind. Little by little, with incessant conferences which he had held with his friends, he had drawn the lines of his scheme firm and true. There had been moments of hesitation when he had felt himself entirely unequal to the magnitude of the task that awaited him, but his dominant mood was peace. He felt himself in the hands of a destiny stronger than himself. He was swept out upon an unknown sea, yet the course which the little boat of his life had taken was so definite that he could not doubt the presence of some invisible helmsman. For the obverse side of his liberation was surrender. He had gained liberty only to resign it into the hands of one wiser and stronger than himself. It seemed to his friends, and at times to himself, that his whole nature had undergone some mysterious process of reconstruction. Intellectually, he was the same man, but morally he was a different man. His whole character was sweetened and softened, and yet there was no element of conscious effort to which he could attribute the change. That was the strange thing over which his mind often meditated with sincere wonder. He had not worked, but had been worked upon. The force which had reshaped him was an external force. It did not arise within himself. It owed nothing to his own volition. Was it a new birth? That inexplicable miracle which only Christ himself could explain? The blowing of a wind whose sound is heard, but whose source is great? Which passes through the sterile places of the heart and leaves behind it fertility and life? It seemed so to those who knew Gaunt best. There began to be apparent in him a certain mystic quality. It manifested itself in a curious combination of charm and authority, so that without the least demand on his part, all those with whom he came into contact accepted his leadership. He conquered men because he had been conquered himself, or perhaps it would be truer to say because he had been conquered. Perhaps nothing of his afterlife afforded so severe a test of his character as these 4 weeks of waiting for the lifting of the curtain. He was modest under the immense notoriety that had suddenly come to him through Butler's press campaign. But it says even more for the change that had been wrought in him that he was patient under the daily provocations which he endured from those whose hostility to him became more open as his notoriety increased. "They don't understand, poor fellows," was his only comment on many of the insulting letters. Cranks of every description waited on him. He had never guessed before how many mad people there were in the world. One propagandist lady desired to know his views on marriage, and when she found that on this point, at least, he was severely orthodox, proceeded to deliver for his benefit a ranting half-hour lecture on the servitude of women. Marriage, she affirmed, is an unholy institution, designed in the days of women's innocency for her perpetual enslavement, and she called on Gaunt in excited tones to set women free. It did not appear precisely from what woman was to be freed, or what she was to do with her freedom when she got it. The only apparent thing was that the poor creature had found her own life very bitter, and Gaunt did his best to soothe her. But she proved too obstinately pugnacious for such kindly acts, and raged out of the House of Joy with the shrill assurance that every woman in America would henceforth be Gaunt's relentless enemy. A crank of a totally different order was a mild-mannered gentleman with tired eyes and a subdued pulpit manner of address, who was a long time in coming to the point. This gentleman appeared to be the author of a railroad scheme in the distant West, which was to be conducted on purely philanthropic lines, no shares being issued to anyone who was not a Christian man whose character and money were without taint. Under these unusual conditions of railroad construction, he proposed to build a truly Christian railroad, and he thought it would be an admirable thing if Gaunt would allow a prospectus of his most original scheme to be distributed through the Madison Square Garden, coupling it with a request that Grant should be good enough to mention the enterprise in his sermon. It was very hard to convince this amiable gentleman that railroad enterprises, whether Christian or otherwise, did not furnish a fit theme for religious addresses. "I know that most people would think so," he remarked in a gentle deprecation. "Indeed, I have already interviewed several ministers in New York on the subject without success. But I thought you were a different sort of man, sir." "Not different enough for that, I'm afraid," Guant replied. It was a long time before this mild-mannered enthusiast could be persuaded to go away, and when he went it was with the sorrowful conviction, which he earnestly impressed on Guant, that the greatest opportunity which he had ever had of doing good was escaping him. Then Roberts wrote him a bitter letter in which he accused him of having wrecked Mayfield Avenue Church by his ambition and eccentricity, and Jordan waited on him with vehement prophecies of impending financial and moral bankruptcy. It seemed that Jordan had really come to get matter for a so-called interview, which appeared a few days later in a religious journal. In the interview there was scarcely a sentence which Guant had really uttered. It consisted entirely of a series of bitter and derisive comments upon Guant and his movement. He was described as a man whose conversion to spiritual ideals was so recent that most reasonable persons would be cautious in accepting the conversion as genuine. Everyone knew that any attraction he had exerted was based solely upon a reputation which he had been able to build up for a literary scholarship, and it was probable that he knew a great deal more about Browning than he did about the gospel of Jesus Christ. What men wanted was the old gospel, pure and unadulterated, and Guant had never yet given any evidence of loyalty to the old gospel, which alone was able to make men wise unto salvation. He had notoriously failed in his own church, and it was not until that failure was evident and humiliating that he had suddenly posed as a religious reformer. Again, all reasonable men would be extremely slow to accept a new religious leader, one who had not been able to retain the loyalty of his own congregation. As for the House of Joy, it was a fantastic name for a fantastic and mischievous social adventure. It would end, as all other schemes for community life had ended, in failure and probably in disgrace. It was quite evident that Gaunt's mind was slightly unbalanced, and that the present notoriety which he had attained was not favorable to his recovery. He had now become an adventurer who preyed upon the credulity and fanaticism of weak-minded Christian people. There was much more of the same sort, followed by a letter signed by Roberts, and said to have been prepared in consultation with his fellow deacons, in which what he called, quote, "the true facts of Dr. Gaunt's case," unquote, were set forth. According to these facts, the real reason why Guant had resigned the Mayfield Avenue Church was nothing more or less than this, that his ministry had been a failure. It might be only a coincidence that the late pastor of that influential church had become a reformer only when he had failed as a preacher. Such coincidences certainly might happen, but Dr. Gaunt's former associates in Mayfield Avenue Church knew him too well to regard them as accidental. Butler smiled grimly when Guant showed him the article. "This is what I expected," he remarked. "When a man walks in the sunshine, the snakes come out to bite at his heels. Success makes enemies." "Poor fellows, they don't understand," said Guant. "For that reason it would be folly to try to enlighten them. I suppose your first thought was to answer this venomous stuff." "I did think of it," said Guant. "Well, think of it no more," said Butler. "You will get plenty more of this kind of thing before you are through. It's good rule with such antagonists as these never to argue, never to contradict, generally to forget. Besides, nothing makes them so conscious of their own inferiority as silence. In matters of controversy, when a man is obviously very anxious for you to speak, don't." But the article, with its calculated malice, nevertheless had its effect. It went around the so-called orthodox religious press, and the champions of orthodoxy arose in their wrath. One of those champions, an old theological professor, whose classes Guant had had the misfortune to attend for a year, came to see him. How well Guant remembered those classes. The professor had thought his duty accomplished when he informed his students how many times Abraham was mentioned in the scriptures, and had delivered to them without the least explanation the cut-and-dried dogmas of medieval theologies, but not once had he ever made them feel the real message of the gospel, or enabled them to see what the life of Jesus meant. The professor came to see Guant in no friendly spirit, as was soon evident. With his white hair, narrow brow, and spare form, he presented a venerable figure, but it was soon manifest that years had done nothing to soften the asperity of his temper or to enlarge his thoughts. He also spoke of the old gospel as if it were a mystery which he alone understood, and accused Guant of betraying it. On the contrary, Guant remonstrated, I have gone back to it, a gospel much older than theology, and even older than the church. But it was useless to argue with the old man, who was convinced that he lived in the period of the world's final apostasy, which conviction he supported by strange references to Bighorn and Little Horn from the book of Revelations, and the beast who came out of the sea, and the woman in scarlet raiment. Let us part as friends, said Guant, but the old man drew away from him in anger, exclaiming that he would take the hand of no man who is a traitor to the truth. And so Guant once more had to answer, poor fellow, he just doesn't understand. There were other visitors, too, of a very different type, people who came late at night because they had only the scant leisure of a working man. Many of them were of that intelligent and thoughtful type which may be found on Sunday nights at the Cooper Institute, men with calloused hands that spoke of hard work, who had used their narrow opportunities of culture in mastering the principles of social and political economy. They were all of them hostile to the church, and Guant soon discovered that the primary attraction he had for them was that he had broken with the church. But if they were hostile to the church, they were far from hostile to religious ideas. They regarded Jesus as the greatest of thinkers and reformers, who was crucified by the capitalist classes, who distorted the meaning of his gospel, suppressed its real teachings, and finally manufactured out of it a weapon of tyranny. The more Guant saw of these men, the more his heart went out to them, and he found in their interest in him the brightest possible augury for his work. They were socialists in theory, and some of them might be justly called anarchists, but there was one distinguishing quality which he found in all of them, a real passion for humanity, a vehement desire for human betterment, a true sense of the part which collectivist ideas must play in the future reconstruction of society. These are the best Christians I have met yet, he said to Palmer. Of course, Palmer answered. In their own way, these men are feeling after the same social ideas which Jesus formulated. If Jesus came to New York, as he once came to Jerusalem, in the raiment of a carpenter, it is among these men he would probably find his first disciples. And that's the end of Chapter 15, Part A. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 15, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.